All right, I think we're gonna start slowly, maybe. I want to welcome you all to this ISBMR webinar series. My name is Lisbeth Thompson, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Southern Denmark. And with me to co-moderate this webinar, I have Dr. Annika Shimonti from Brigham and Women's Hospital at Howard. For those of you who are new to the International Society of Bone Morphometry, we cover all aspects of quantitative assessment of bone across all scales. We offer leadership panels and early career opportunities, such as the Early Career Stage Investigator Committee, which is hosting the webinars. We also have working groups in different areas, such as high-resolution pico-QCT, spatial transcriptomics, imaging and analysis of nerves and bone and micro-ultrastructure assessment. All these working groups have frequent meetings working on expanding the fields. On behalf of the Early Career Investigator Committee, I want to welcome you all to this webinar. And before we start, there's a few announcements. Please join us for our next webinar in July, where Professor Anne-Marie Lang will give a talk on the 29th. The time will be advised a little bit later. Also want to bring your attention to this first international hands-on course on bone histology and histomorphometry, which takes place here in Denmark in October. It's a fantastic opportunity to explore the home of Hans Christian Andersen while training some hands-on on bone histology and histomorphometry. And you need to block your date, your calendar for the dates for ISBM in London in 2026 has been set. So block the dates from July 3rd to July 7th. And if you forgot all of these dates or you want to stay updated on information from the ISBM, please follow us on LinkedIn. And finally, we want to thank our corporate partner, AstraZeneca, for supporting the ISBM webinar series. And now for the moment I've been looking forward to, it's my great privilege to present the speaker of this webinar, Dr. David Cooper. Dr. Cooper is a professor in anatomy and physiology and pharmacology at the University of Saskatchewan. He started his career in the same place where he did his bachelor and master in paleobiology and anatomy, respectively. Following this, he completed his PhD at the University of Calgary and did a postdoc at the University of British Columbia before he returned back to the University of Saskatchewan. Here, his work has included the use of the Canadian light source Synchrotron, and the talk of this webinar is entitled 4-Dimensional Perspectives on Bone Remodeling, New Insights Through In Vivo Synchrotron Imaging. I hope you will enjoy the talk. Professor Cooper, the screen is yours.
Thanks, Lisbeth. Do you have to unshare before I can share?
Yes, I'll just unshare. Hang on.
I like your plan versus reality.
Yes. Oh, it's because, yeah, it's in the wrong screen. Oh, sorry. Now you can share.
Okay, hopefully we tested this earlier and it worked. So just give me 1 second to get set up.
There you go.
Okay, how's that look?
Perfect. Ready to go.
Just going to hide the floating meeting. Okay, well, thank you very much, Lisbeth, and I really appreciate the opportunity and the kind introduction. I was thinking about my title this morning, and I probably should have had 4-dimensional perspectives on cortical bone remodeling, although I'm going to work in a little bit of trabecular stuff at the end. Okay. Yeah, and once again, thanks for the invitation and the opportunity. I realize in the Northern Hemisphere, we're into summer now, and we're in the longest days of the year, so I appreciate people's attention and taking time out of your summer breaks if you're in the north. It's increasingly customary in Canada to acknowledge the traditional lands that we live and work on. And so I am at the University of Saskatchewan. And if you're not familiar with Canadian geography, Saskatchewan's kind of smack dab in the middle. If you're more familiar with American geography, we're right above North Dakota and Montana. And this territory that we live on is Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. The Métis people are a fusion of European cultures and First Nation cultures. And the other thing I want to acknowledge right off the hop is that science, and particularly synchrotron science, is a team sport. So I'll be showing you a lot of the work that we've been doing over the last decade or two, and really there's a lot of people that have contributed to this, and I'd be remiss to not acknowledge them, and I'm sure I'm going to miss some of them, but some of the major contributors include Schwen, Kim, Lindsay, and Arash, and there are others. And so I thought I would throw the acknowledgement slide up front because, again, this is really a team sport. Okay, in terms of a quick overview, I know I'm preaching to the choir, so I'm going to talk a little bit about cortical bone remodeling in terms of what it is and how it works and why it's important. But I'm going to spend more time talking about three-dimensional to four-dimensional imaging. I'm focusing on animal imaging here, so preclinical. And then talking about some of the ways we've used this imaging at the synchrotron to sort of get new insights into remodeling. So I'll give you a number of examples and sort of try to synthesize some of that information and then talk about future directions as I go forward. So when I talk about cortical bone remodeling here, I'm going to use the Frostian definition. This is Harold Frost. And when we're talking about remodeling, it's kind of an unfortunate term because it's become a catch-all. It's obviously a common English word, and many people just use it for skeletal change. But Frost's envisioning of remodeling was a process of internal turnover by basic multicellular units, and these are collections of osteoclasts, osteoblasts, and their related progenitor cells. And these BMUs produce bone structural units known as secondary osteons or Haversian systems. So this is just an example, and I'll show you a lot of images. So I'll just kind of orient you here. In terms of three-dimensional micro-CT, we can see the remodeling space at the center that's of a remodeling unit that's created by a BMU. We can't see the cells here in the imaging, but this is just a three-dimensional image, cross-sections from micro-CT, and then ground section histology. So we have osteoclasts boring a hole through the bone. Osteoblasts will be filling it back in, and this process produces, again, secondary osteons. This is just another perspective on it in terms of a very schematic level, basic multicellular unit. And I know if Thomas is here, he'll be cringing because I have nothing between osteoclasts and osteoblasts. But we have an osteoclastic cutting cone, an osteoblastic closing cone that closes it back in. And then there's a phase of reversal and reversal resorption, depending on the literature that you're into. Increasingly, there's sort of a mix of cells where we have osteoclasts continuing to expand the space mixed in with osteoprogenitors that ultimately reach some threshold density and begin filling the space back in. If you bore these holes through the cortical bone and you don't refill them all the way, well, if you refill them down to a normal Haversian canal diameter, we have something we call balanced remodeling. If you don't fill the space in all the way, that's often called imbalanced, and that's been associated with osteoporotic change. And if you bore the hole and don't fill it in at all, that's been described as uncoupled between the osteoclasts and the osteoblasts. And just a couple of microradiographs spliced together here between a 20-year-old woman. This is a mid-femoral cross-section from the Melbourne Femur Collection. A 20-year-old woman and an 87-year-old woman. And I hope you can appreciate pretty clearly, you get thinning of the cortex, coalescence of pores, increased porosity with advanced age. But remodeling is important from the get-go. And so even in the younger woman, if you look carefully, you'll see remodeling spaces and newer osteons that are here. So the process is important, but it can go off the rails. And so again, I know I'm preaching to the choir in terms of biomedical significance. Obviously, the balance within BMUs between resorption and formation is linked to osteoporosis. BMUs play a role in fracture healing, graft integration, implant stability, and with increasing interest in exploring space in zero gravity or even on the moon or Mars, for example, BMUs become important in terms of maintaining bone mass. And so one of the big questions is, can we modulate BMU? I put in quotes behavior here. And this lies at the heart of a lot of targeted manipulations to preserve bone turnover and bone mass, et cetera. And this has been a question that's been driving our research program. Now, I mean, that kind of begs the question of what do we know about the dynamic behavior of BMUs? And I thought I would take a little step back and just talk about some historical studies. And this is Takahashi and Norimatsu from 1976. I'm going to date myself. That's the year I was born. So I'm kind of partial to this work that was done in the 70s. And this is just a schematic drawing of a BMU. CC is just the cutting cone, and then, of course, labeling. So obviously, bone formation can be labeled and tracked by fluorochromes, and this is a classic dynamic histomorphometry technique. But if you want to track resorption, you really can only infer from it in histology because you can't infer, you don't know where the space was originally. So I'll walk you through this. So here are two dual labels just labeled in green here. I think everybody's familiar with this. In cross section, you can measure the mineral apposition rate radially. But you can also look at the distance along this. So this is a longitudinal section. You can look at the distance traveled between these labels, and this would be like a longitudinal formation rate. And from that, it has been inferred the longitudinal erosion rate. And so I just put this red, hopefully you can see my mouse, this sort of red dash line. You don't know that, right? You have to infer that because in a histological slice, all you get is the final step. And so if you look at these classic studies from the 1970s, they consistently came back with longitudinal erosion rates, so the movement of BMUs through bone at about 40 microns a day. And I'm going to keep that number in your mind because it's going to come back. And I'm going to really focus on longitudinal erosion rate as one of our primary outcomes that we've pursued. But obviously, there's other measures, complementary histology, and a lot more that can be done. But this is a good focal point. And then just sticking with Takahashi and Norimatsu for a moment, here's a graph. So I've brought the same image back in. Here's a graph of the distance between the labels against the distance from the second label to the cutting cone. And they did find a correlation here, but this is the kind of graph that you don't, race to show your supervisor and really excited about. And I think the real take-home message here is the enormous amount of variation. So if you look at the length between these labels on the bottom on the x-axis, you can calculate those into longitudinal formation rates, which again, you would translate into the rate the BMU is moving forward if it's balanced and stable. And keep these numbers in mind, about 25 to 75 microns, with the average hovering again around 40. The real interesting bit here too, if you look at the scale, it's quite large. So 400 microns to 1200, so 1.2 millimeters. There is enormous variation here in the proportions of these BMUs and in the rates that they're moving. And I think if you take nothing else home from this presentation, variation is something that, it's inherent to biology, and it's something we grapple with, and we don't escape it with more advanced imaging. And it's trying to understand that variation. I think that it's really fascinating and the really interesting bit to pursue. Okay, so one of the things that sort of I've thought long and hard about this and driving a significant portion of our research program and my career is that, BMUs, these basic multicellular units, have never been replicated in vitro. You can't make one in a petri dish. If I'm wrong, please send me the paper. But this idea of combining osteoclast, osteoblasts, in a petri dish and having it bore a cylindrical hole through a piece of bone doesn't exist yet. I'll put yet on there. They've rarely been studied in situ in 3 dimensions, and I'll give you a couple examples in a moment. And they've really defied direct study in vivo for the most part in terms of 4 dimensions, so 3 dimensions over time. Now, the exception proves the rule. And so in recent years, there's been a lot of more work done, some really advanced histology, particularly out of Denmark, and Thomas Andersen and Christina Andreassen's work here. And this is just a couple examples showing 3-dimensional reconstructions from histology, showing the positions of osteoclasts in a cutting cone and the vasculature within a remodeling event. So really quite impressive and exquisite work. Quite tedious and hard work too. So I'm really impressed. Now our group has taken a slightly different tack, and we've focused on 4-dimensional imaging as a novel window on how to get at remodeling dynamics. And it's really a complementary technique. And if I go back to that, one of the first images I showed you, we can see remodeling spaces. We can't see the cells. We can't see all the details. And so we're limited, but we do have this opportunity to get dynamic information. So if you think about cortical bone imaging, you've probably seen me present this slide. If you've seen me present before, this is a oldie but a goodie. If you think about cortical bone imaging, clinically, DEXA is the gold standard. You can't differentiate cortical bone from trabecular bone, but you get an aerial bone mineral density. When you move into computed tomography, so quantitative computed tomography, whether it's peripheral or not, that's the P here, you can get volumetric density in the cortex. And that correlates quite strongly with porosity. And these 2 images are actually made from each other, so I'm kind of cheating here. But when you skip over from QCT towards micro-CT, you begin to start resolving the actual individual pores. And this 3-dimensional image here in red, I actually created when I was a PhD student in Calgary over 20 years ago. This was a test scan by Skyscan in Belgium of a little piece of human metacarpal, if I remember. And we were very excited about this. But even at the time, we were thinking, could we could we get at this dynamically? Could we look at the pores changing? And of course, if you go to higher resolutions, you can start imaging or visualizing individual osteons, osteocyte lacunae, and this is the realm of synchrotron micro-CT and also non-synchrotron nano-CT. So why don't we micro-CT people? Why don't we have really high-resolution images of cortical bone and cortical porosity in humans? And the answer in a single word is radiation. And so there's, from X-ray-based imaging, there's a real divide between what's possible in vivo in humans and what becomes the realm of ex vivo, with the notable point that technologies keep pushing this line. And so this is the extreme CT from Scanco. There's now an extreme 2 that's slightly higher resolution. And in red here, they've rendered the cortical pores. And so we're sort of hovering on this line where we could potentially track, I think, remodeling spaces in human bones using something like an extreme CT. But if you want to push into more detailed morphology, you're really in the realm of animal models, and that's what I'm going to focus on today. Now, when we're talking about preclinical imaging, so this is animal imaging, I wanted to throw up this slide because I remember when Varsing and colleagues' paper came out in 2004, when we were super excited. And this superimposition, you could scan an animal, I believe this is rats, and you could superimpose multiple scans, and you look at where bone is resorbed and where it's formed. And look at this is 2004, this is over 20 years ago. A very recent paper here from Xu et al. In 2025 making advances on that. But I have to say that there's, as much as micro-CT has exploded, this whole multiple time points co-registered in 3 dimensions and then focal analysis of those changes has largely been in the trabecular realm, and it's been quite limited. And if you want to look at I know I'm getting old now because to me 2017 is quite recent, but there's a great review by Kristen and Muller on this topic. But I think it's fair to say most of this work has been in trabecular bone or in cortical surfaces, and it's been quite limited relative to, I would say, like the cross-sectional use of micro-CT to study bone over time. Now, that's not to say people haven't measured cortical porosity using in vivo micro-CT scanners. And I know this is a busy slide, but I wanted to throw up a number of examples. Here's growing rats with primary pores in the metaphysis, a caudal vertebra implant model by Lee and colleagues, where you can see that the larger pores are being resolved, but it's a little bit tricky for smaller pores. And perhaps the most exciting, and for me anyways, and more aligned with what I'm going to show you next, is McKerney et al. From 2019. And this is a chronic kidney disease model in rats. And you can see the increased pores in the cortex here. And the image over here is somewhat similar to what I'll be showing you later for our work. This is co-registered and subtracted. So anything dark here is bone loss and anything white is bone formation. And you can see the creation of endosteal pores in the rat here. And so I don't want to leave the impression when I start talking about synchrotrons that there's no pathway in conventional technology, and I'm always excited to see where people are taking things. Okay, so what are the limits even when we're talking about animals? It's ultimately radiation dose. And radiation dose and the image quality, so we're talking about signal to noise ratio, for example, in terms of a measure of quality, they're closely related. And so if you want better images, you need to put in more dose. And if you want higher resolution, you need to put even more dose in. And this is a paper by Nancy Ford, who's a faculty now at University of British Columbia. She did this work in London, Ontario with David Holdsworth. And they had worked out a theoretical 2 to the 4th power relation between dose and resolution. So for computed tomography. So what does that mean? People intuitively think, okay, I double the resolution, I've doubled the dose. No. If you double the resolution, it's 16 times the dose to get images of the same image quality. So this is ultimately why we don't have those images in humans, and this is ultimately a concern when we get to imaging animals. So the big question driving a lot of what we've done is, can we use synchrotron microcomputed tomography to push the limits of 4-dimensional imaging and enable tracking of individual BMUs? Of course, that begs the question of what is a synchrotron? And so a synchrotron, in a word, is a couple words, is a circular particle accelerator. And so here, this is a schematic of the Canadian light source synchrotron. You have a linear accelerator that injects electrons into a booster ring. It brings them up to nearly the speed of light. Then it puts them in a storage ring. They're held in that ring by magnets. They're deflected. And every time that electron beam is deflected, it produces a tangential beam of radiation. So you have multiple what are called beam lines coming off, and they each generally focus probably on a small portion of the spectrum in terms of the X-ray energy. It's not necessarily X-rays either. So light coming off in a wide spectrum here, and the beam lines are focused on certain areas. So we have a biomedical imaging and therapy beam line at the Canadian Light Source. This is BEAMIT that we do our animal imaging on. Ultimately, in terms of being an X-ray source, the synchrotrons have very intense radiation, which means that you can throw most of it away. And so it's like thinking of white light. If you put it through a prism and you can see different colors, at the synchrotron, you're generally imaging with a very precise color of X-rays, if there is such a thing. I don't know what color X-rays are. The other piece of it is you have a very small X-ray source and you can get a long distance from it. So our beamline is 40 meters, which maybe sounds impressive. But at Spring 8, their biomedical beamline, for example, is 225 meters long. So the X-ray beam becomes increasingly parallel, and you can do very precise high-resolution imaging. Okay, so other than being a very intense X-ray source, why would we want to use a synchrotron? And there's multiple synchrotron techniques, and I'm only going to talk about one here, and that's propagation phase contrast. And so in normal X-ray imaging, this is absorption contrast. You have a source, you have a target, and you see the object by absorption of the X-rays. And you often have soft edges because some of the edge of the object might be part in air or part in soft tissue, for example, and part in something like bone. And I've thrown this is an actual image of a spider. So here's an absorption image here. In phase contrast, if you have a coherent X-ray source, and again, if it's monochromatic, you have a wavefront that hits the object. Some of it's obviously absorbed, but also the X-rays get deflected by their interactions, refraction within the object. And you get interference patterns that can be picked up on the detector by increasing the distance between the object and the detector. This is probably the easiest way of developing phase contrast. There are many others, so I'm not going to talk about them. And so the phase image in the spider here, I hope you can appreciate the bright white fringes that highlight all the edges and make it much sharper. And at higher resolution, it becomes even clearer, this phase fringe. And you can even see little hairs on this spider here. Now, I have deceived you here because this image is not a synchrotron image of a spider. It's actually made from a liquid metal jet microfocus source. There's a Swedish company that markets these. And I wanted to include that to also drive home the fact that you can produce propagation phase contrast images off synchrotron. It's just that the synchrotron is the easiest implementation with the highest flux, and it helps with animal imaging. Okay, so here's an actual synchrotron example in rat bones. This is a rat tibia, and we're just looking at a portion of it. And the only thing that's changed here is this R2 value. So R2 is the distance between the target and the detector. And here on the bottom are just the values. So if you put the bone right up against the detector, which is the conventional configuration for imaging, you can make out the bone and you can begin to make out some of the vascular pores. As you increase the distance, however, those pores become very sharp. And if you squint here, you might even be able to see osteocyte lacunae coming into view, even though this detector, I think, was 10 microns or 12 micron resolution. So we really shouldn't be able to see the lacunae in absorption contrast. If you keep going, you get increasingly disrupted image from interference from all the refraction in the wavefront. And so there's a sweet spot that you can tune to depending on the targets you're looking at and the resolution you're imaging at to see this. So the real take-home message here is that these are all the same radiation dose. So this becomes a pathway to seeing more with equivalent or possibly less dose. And this is just an example. This is rat radius scanned in a desktop or laboratory in vivo micro-CT and in synchrotron phase contrast micro-CT at much lower dose. And I hope you can appreciate, you can see all the little pores. Now we began this work in the synchrotron in rats. And so this is some of the first sequential scans. I'm not going to talk much about rats. In fact, I'm going to pivot very quickly here to other things. We thought we made great progress. We were able to put images together. We thought we were seeing remodeling events. Maybe we were. But everyone's probably familiar with small rodents have very low rates of cortical bone remodeling. And we were very interested in perhaps using fatigue loading to increase this. So this is Bentulila's work with resorption spaces around microcracks. And Kim from my lab is probably here. She's probably got PTSD from this image. We really struggled to get this model to work, and we pivoted off of it to rabbits. And I think that was a fruitful avenue, but it was a good starting point. So we did a very first proof of principle study in rabbits. We had 10 rabbits that we scanned in the synchrotron 2 weeks apart. And I just have highlighted here in red, 1 rabbit in 10 actually showed remodeling spaces. Here it is, it's full of large spaces in its cortex. And we were able to co-register them. So scan 1 and then scan 2 is 2 weeks later. And this is just one example of a remodeling event, a remodeling space moving in time. So this was both exciting and frustrating because we didn't understand why 9 of the 10 rabbits showed nothing. And that's a pattern that's kind of played out. And we had to take a step back and develop other models. So looking at OVX, glucocorticoids, combinations, and PTH to increase the amount of porosity and remodeling that's going on. So this really set the stage for what I'm going to show you next in terms of where we're at in terms of tracking BMUs. But it was a bit of a detour to try to figure out. We still don't know why that 1 rabbit had high rates of remodeling, but clearly there was something different. Okay, so hopefully I've set the stage fairly well there to talk about some of the examples that we've implemented in rabbits. And I'm just going to walk you through our general approach. We generally acquire the animals and acclimatize them. We would begin a treatment sequence, and 2 weeks into it, we would image alive at the synchrotron. And then 2 weeks later after that, we would sacrifice the animals and do a higher resolution ex vivo imaging, generally in the lab, but also increasingly we've been using the synchrotron for this. All of the data I'm going to show you from female animals that are 6 months old at the beginning of the trials. And all of the imaging is in the distal tibia. In the synchrotron, we can't move the beam, so we have to spin the animal. And so the distal limb is pretty much one of the only targets we can get at really high resolution. It's also the safest place to image in terms of radiation impacts. So we take that in vivo scan and we co-register it with the ex vivo scan, and we get something like this, where orange here is the first time point. You can kind of see it ghosted in, and green is the second time point. And we can track movement in these remodeling spaces. So hopefully this is working here. This is just a 3D rendering from one of the rabbits. Again, orange is 2 weeks in, and this animal is PTH dosed, and green is 4 weeks. So there are 2 week separation between the two. Okay, so that's rotated around, and I'll just draw your attention to these. These are fairly classic looking BMUs or remodeling spaces, orange advancing into green. And I'm just going to zoom in. The way we've developed to measure the longitudinal erosion rate is just to manually landmark the surfaces and get those 3-dimensional distances. We are working with Peter Pavanka in Queensland and a student there in terms of automating this and using AI to detect it. But thus far, everything I'm going to show you is manual landmarking. So these distances here in 3D. So when we started this work, one of our key questions was, does the radiation dose we use impact the BMU progression? So one of our earliest trials, what we did was we used PTH to increase the number of BMUs present, because again, I showed you what 9 out of 10 animals showed very low remodeling rates. So we wanted to make sure we had something to measure. So we gave PTH for 4 weeks, and at the 2-week period, we did 3 radiation levels, 1, 2.5, and 5 gray. And even at 1 gray, I would say this is probably double what the normal dose that would be given to like a rat in terms of in vivo micro CT might be. So these are fairly high doses. We were explicitly trying to get in effect. In fact, we tried to go higher than this, but that's a story for another time. And just to drive home the fact that dose is image quality, the top image is 1 gray, 2.5, and then 5 gray on the bottom. And I hope you can appreciate the decrease in noise. You can see remodeling events in all of these tibial cortices, but at the higher doses, you can start to see much more of the fine structure. And we need that to ensure our co-registrations are accurate. They become biological fiducials. But the take home here with the rabbits was we didn't see an impact of the radiation dose on the speed of advance of BMUs, which was encouraging. The puzzling bit was that the number we got was about 24 microns a day, which is quite a bit lower than what we talked about earlier in terms of 40 microns from the classic studies in dogs. And so that was a bit of a head scratcher, and we'll explore that further. A large advantage of the approach was that we were able in this trial to measure 189 BMUs. And so looking at a large volume of bone means you can get a lot more remodeling events. Now, the other thing about PTH is it induced a very variable response. So this is just activation frequency here. Compared to sham controls, PTH could be very similar, or it could have a huge number of remodeling events induced. In some animals, we saw extensive endosteal modeling of woven bone. So that's what you're seeing here, this darker gray stuff on the endosteum. Extensive remodeling in the cortex in some animals through massively increased activation, and some very complex BMUs in these PTH-dosed animals. And this is just an example here. So again, orange, and then 2 weeks later is the green. Now, using PTH and getting this lower number for LER begs the question, well, is PTH actually impacting the progression of the BMUs, and what would we expect it might do? And looking to the literature, this is Michael Parfit's work in 1983, he had proposed that you could estimate longitudinal erosion rate by looking at the length of closing cones divided by the time of radial closure. So let me just walk you through that. In the time that it takes to fill this space, the cutting cone has to advance its full length in order for the full structure to maintain itself, to be in balance. And so the radial closure speeds up with PTH dosing. So this number on the bottom becomes smaller. So here's activate. This is osteonal mineral apposition rate from PTH. For rabbits, it's elevated relative to shams. So we actually expected PTH to speed up the BMUs. That was the expectation if this relation held true. So we tested this hypothesis with a PTH withdrawal study. We didn't use control animals here because we didn't expect to see a lot. And so we had animals dosed with PTH for 4 weeks and animals dosed with PTH for 2 weeks to induce BMUs, and then we withdrew the treatment. And what we found was directly counter to what we expected. First, for PTH, the number was a little higher than before. It was around 30, and if you remember, the other one was 24. But PTH withdrawal was pushing close to that expected 40 from the classic literature. So the BMUs actually sped up. This is cross-sectionally. We didn't track individual BMUs here. But this is directly counter to what we expected. So it looks like PTH not only increases the rate of bone formation within the BMUs, but it slows them down. It definitely increases the number of them. So there's an interest. This is in cortex, so it's an interesting pattern that's induced. A very large number of BMUs could be tracked in this study of 14 animals, 612, aiming for 50 per animal. I know I'm hitting you with a battery of trials, but I'll summarize it in a moment. And then another question we asked was whether glucocorticoids impact BMU progression. And we were interested in this question because the increasing focus in the literature on the uncoupling that's been described for glucocorticoids, where you get a real decrease of bone or absence of bone formation. And this is a trabecular BMU. Here's an imbalanced one, but it's filling in. And here's an uncoupled one where there's no infill. And so we had expected long projected spaces with no evidence of infilling, sort of this uncoupled range here. And in order to test this hypothesis, we did finally have a control group. So we have control animals and ovary hysterectomized animals, glucocorticoids, and a combination of the two. And these are just some representative BMUs. What we ultimately found was that the sham and the overectomized look quite similar, but the glucocorticoids, we didn't see the long projected resorption spaces without infilling. What we saw was radially expanding spaces that were completely disrupted. And if you look at this, this is consistent with what you might see histologically, but the 4-dimensional perspective, I think, was unique in sort of identifying this disrupted advance. And when we measured the rate of advance, you can see in the glucocorticoids, it was 1/10 of the remaining, or the controls, whether they're sham or OVH. Okay, so what have we learned so far putting this all together? And I'll just throw this graph up. And one of the things I really want to draw your attention to is when it comes to sham controls, that we only have 26 BMUs in 3 of, so this slash here means we looked at 5 rabbits, 2 didn't have any BMUs at all that we could track. So 26 BMUs from 3 animals, these are our only true controls. But you can see this pattern that's developing up here, and I'll revisit this. Now I'm going to spoil, there's a bit of a spoiler here. There's one more PTH group we've done, and MI means multiple imaging points. But when we put this all together, there's an interesting pattern, I think, that starts to emerge, and that PTH consistently reduces the linear erosion rate in BMUs and induces complex morphologies. when you release the animal, like when you withdraw from PTH, they start returning to what I would maybe call a normal LER. And with the caveat that 40 microns here, which is spot on to the classic studies in dogs, this is 26 BMUs, but many more here in the OVH. And then, of course, glucocorticoids disrupted and much, much slower. So I think a pattern is emerging, and we haven't really thought through the full significance of it, but PTH is really proving to be quite interesting. Very rapid responses and returns with withdrawal. And I'll talk about that a little bit here, just cognizant of the time. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about future directions. This is the spoiler that I already gave you. This is the multi-time point imaging. We have done a trial where we scanned 3 times in vivo. So day 0, 5, and 10, these are 5 days apart, and then ex vivo at day 15. And these were PTH dosed animals. And at the beginning of this BMU, so orange to yellow looks quite normal. Blue, it starts getting quite complex, and by green, it's branching all over the place. And it's just a good example of what PTH is capable of. When we looked at tracking the longitudinal erosion rate across these different time frames, we didn't see any change. So from day 0 to 5, 5 to 10, 10 to 15, and this is the overall days 0 to 15. So no change across repeated scanning was encouraging because we were worried about repeated imaging events, perhaps the radiation having an impact. So we didn't see an apparent change. That doesn't mean there wasn't an impact. What was also curious about this is that PTH, so if you look at the speed of these things are down at 24, so this is low again. We had maybe expected PTH to take a little while to slow them down, but this suggests that the effect of PTH on that speed is very rapid. And then I showed you the withdrawal study. Within 2 weeks, they're back up to normal speed. So PTH has this very sort of dramatic and rapid effect, is the picture that's developing. Now, we're very excited about this multiple imaging. Each animal can serve as its own control. So these were just PTH dose, but you can see we can track each animal's speed. So each animal is its own control, and each BMU can also serve as its own potential control. And this is just a plot. This is a real mess. I know it's 210, and we haven't cleaned it. And we don't know what's going on with some of these really high rate ones. But for the most part, the BMUs stay fairly well constrained within this range of 20 to 40. But the potential exists here to induce a wave of remodeling, measure it, and get baselines for BMUs or animals, and then manipulate it. And we're like, whether it's pharmaceutical dose or loading or other things, so we're quite excited about that prospect. And this is just an example zooming in on one animal. So in this animal in red, here's a BMU that's slowing down, one that's speeding up, and the blue one is just staying flat across those time frames. And so you see collections of these in individual animals. Some of them are starting up, some of them are slowing down. We don't know, but we're able to get a more refined picture of their behavior using this approach. Very interested in what controls BMU trajectory and branching. This is just a couple examples from Van Oors in 2008 in terms of simulation and removing load. So this is the hypothesis that load will drive the direction of the cutting cone, and removing load will produce a random response. We could test that. Looking at steering towards microcracks, this comes back to the rat work that we began with. And I remember, I think this image on the right was provided by Lindsay or Kim from our group. And I remember saying I'd never seen a BMU hang a turn like this image, which is obviously just a dramatic example. And then I think it was Kim or Lindsay sent me this image of a white is time 1 and red is time 2. And it does a pretty dramatic turn and branches to boot. So some interesting potentials on that front. We're interested in exploring comparative analyses in terms of intra and interspecies variation. How do they vary with age, sex, disease, and other factors? And how well does the rabbit model reflect human remodeling is a good question. These are examples from human BMUs from the mid-femur. Here's a highly clustered set, highly branched, almost looks like a hand. This is Schwenn's work in our lab. And I haven't had time to do this topic justice, and I am running out of time because we want to leave time for questions. But trying to extract more information from these spaces in terms of the activity, trying to segment them into resorption, reversal, and formation based on their morphology, adding in the fact that we know the rate of advance for them, so we can add in time and convert lengths to durations. And so in this case, the formation in these animals was 12.9 days, reversal was 2.4, and resorption was 4.1 days. So adding additional value or insight with the caveat that we can only see the space, we can't see the cells here. And it's really, that brings me to another one of our future directions that's kind of underway. And I think Elizabeth, I think this was you that joked that this is a Canadian collaboration. And my apologies if I haven't included everyone, but we're very interested in fusing the 4-dimensional imaging with histological imaging, co-registering the two to try to get a more refined picture of relating these activities of resorption, reversal, and formation, bringing in 4-dimensional information from the imaging, but getting the wealth of information that's available for histology that we just can't get at in the imaging approaches. And I talked about cortical bone at the beginning. This is the one set of trabecular images I'm going to show you. This is from a summer student in the lab. We've looked at trench forming and intratrabecular tunneling. This is just an example in the rabbit. You can actually see the very low res, but Hauschips lacunae on this space. This is the bone that's been lost. And we can detect some individual remodeling events in trabecular bone. These are 5-day spaces. But these are all PTH dosed animals, and we get very diffuse formation everywhere. It's quite complex. We thought the trabecular bone would be easier than it is, and it turns out the cortical bone with its nice distinct tunnels is much simpler. But we're heading down this road, and this is looking at calcaneus, which is right in our field of view when we're looking at the distal tibia. So I'm going to stop there. I think I'm reasonably on time, a little bit over. My apologies, Elizabeth. Lots of people to acknowledge and not much time to do it, a number of funders. And if you're into BMUs and imaging, this was funnier before the whole world was on fire, but I will put it into PPE. So we don't expect anyone to fight, but if you're interested in imaging and BMUs, look us up. So I'm going to stop there. This is a student asleep on his stool at the synchrotron after a night of imaging, and he gave me permission to show that. Okay, I'm going to stop.
Thank you, Dr. Cooper, for your presentation. We are open for questions now, and you guys can either add it to the chat or just ask directly. I do have a quick question. I'm just going to start. I know you mentioned something about the rabbit model and how it might be translatable to the humans. I'm going to go the other direction and ask, if I want to do something with mice, how much would that correlate with the rabbit model you're seeing?
I think mice are a great model for trabecular remodeling. So the mice and rats definitely have remodeling of their trabeculae that is widely comparable to humans, I believe, anyway, extensive use of them. But if you're interested in the cortical bone, you get very different responses. You can always find someone that'll argue that they've seen a remodeling event in small rodents, and I'm not saying they're not there, but I think we can agree that a general consensus that the small rodents don't exhibit cortical bone remodeling comparable to humans. And so if you're interested in trabecular bone, I think you're okay. And you obviously see a lot of time-lapse imaging. If you're interested in cortical bone, it's a very different thing. Yeah.
Thanks.
I have a question. Hi, David. Nice talk, as always. Thank you so much. So my question is, in terms of the cortical porosity for a human, so always we are talking cortical porosity. We say, okay, if cortical porosity goes up, we lose the bone strength. My question is, how much porosity is a positive or good pores for the bone? If you imagine we have no pores in the bone, maybe bone becomes brittle or fragile. But how much is the bone get benefit if there's a pores? And the second question is, what about the pores content? Have you had any chance to investigate what's a pore by aging? What happens to pores content, fat or water?
Yeah,
That's
no,
my
they're great questions. I mean, I think cortical bone clearly needs to be it needs plumbing, right? So if you want your osteocytes to stay alive, and I think one of the reasons why you see osteon size stabilizes around the size of dogs and humans, and then it stays stable even in dinosaurs, right? So I think there's a fundamental, you need to be within a certain distance of a vascular supply to keep your osteocytes viable. So you need cortical porosity. That's also the route by which osteoclasts are going to get there to repair damage, et cetera. So reflecting back, I think in normal bone, you're looking at, 5% or less general porosity and quite small pores. Depends on the species, right? The size of the
Yes.
pores. But there's a full spectrum between what I would think of fully compact bone into what would be considered trabecular bone. And you see that at the endosteal surface when you have like trabecularization of the cortex.
Yes.
So I think even when we talk about hemiostional and osteomal remodeling, I think there's probably a spectrum between them, where you start seeing this transition to increasing pore sizes and spaces. So I think it's a gradation, and if you're going to lose bone, it's better to lose it on the endosteal surface and in terms of mechanics. So absolutely, you need the porosity, and without it, you couldn't turn over the bone effectively. In terms of what's in the pores, it's not an area we've studied, but I think with increasing porosity in the cortex, you see invasion of fat. And if I had to think of the most eloquent work in that area in imaging, is probably Galedia Kazakia, who's done this fusion of HR, PQCT, and MRI, showing, she's able with the MRI to detect fat in those pores that you can't see. But yeah, I think expansion of the endosteal, medullary cavity with fat invading the cortex and increased porosity is obviously the pathway to osteoporosis.
Well, thank you.
We have a question in the chat. Catherine Dietrich, does the PTH treatment cause any behavioral changes like lower activity, which might alter mechanical loading and by extension might affect pore formation?
That's a great question. So these rabbits are not particularly active. This is a question that always comes up because they're constrained within cages. I haven't actually observed the animals. I don't know if Kim I don't know if anyone from our group is here. There's been no reports of change in behavior, but that's just secondhand from me. I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in, but we haven't noticed the change.
I was just going to say, I can comment a little bit further. So we evaluate the animals on a daily basis, like when we give them their daily doses, and particularly even more so after the in vivo imaging. So we look for things like behavioral changes in terms of like grooming, overall kind of like appetite, things to that nature. And we haven't noticed anything overt in terms of changes in behavior of the rabbits dosed with PTH. So from a visual standpoint, no change.
Thanks, Kim.
Yep.
I have a question for you, David. That was a beautiful talk, by the way. I was interested in what you're talking about with the longitudinal erosion rate over time. And I wondered whether it was variable depending on the age of the BMU and the rate, how it was progressing. And it seemed like you had two different answers to that question. With the rabbits, it seemed like there was no change over time when you did three time points. But then when you use the multi-imaging procedures, it seems like there was. So how would you come down on that question, or is it still unresolved?
Yeah, it's a great question. I very much appreciate it. I think short answer, it's unresolved. One of the things we haven't done, and we could dig into in those animals and in future trials, we can obviously detect some BMUs that are newly arising. So we could ask between the different time points. So we could go to like day 10 versus 15, and anything newly arising, we could say those are new. Are they going faster? Are they going slower? So we haven't done that yet. When we look at the mean speed in the animal, there's no change. But when we look at the individual BMUs, there's change, with the caveat that each voxel is 10 microns. And so a change of, over 5 days, we have to think about, there's a little bit of error in the imaging, but I think we are detecting patterns of change. Right now it's random. But we simply don't know, but it's a fascinating question. Do they begin fast? Do they stabilize, and do they then slow down? I'm just speculating. But it's something we're very interested in. And I think the multi-time point will be the first window into that, where we can get a baseline and say, here's a stable BMU. What happens over time? I don't know how long they live. So it's by chance that we're going to detect them slowing down. Or do we change the loading or pharmaceutical, or we have hit some of them with alendronate, and at low dose, it just slowed them down. And at higher dose, it started really slowing them down. But yeah, Short answer, we don't know, but we're very curious.
You could probably figure out about, and I think this has been done, about how long they live if you measure a series of the lengths of a series of osteons, and then divide by your average rate of longitudinal extension. That and I don't know what that comes out to be exactly, but some people have done that, I think.
Yeah, no, it's a great point.
Mark has a question. Mark McKee, I think.
Yeah, David, this is Mark from Montreal. In one of your last slides, you showed a beautiful staining, red staining of osteopontin. I presume you're using that to identify cement lines, and I'm wondering how you're integrating that into your studies that you just talked about. And where was that antibody from that works so nicely in rabbits?
These are great questions. So this is work done in Thomas Anderson's lab in Denmark. And so by Lindsay Landigan, who's a postdoc, and Kim, who just spoke, is there too. So I can't give you the specifics on the stain, but absolutely we did it for looking at the extent of resorption. So we could kind of situate the fluorochromes inside that full extent of osteopontin. We can absolutely, if you want to reach out, or we'll reach out to you, we can get you the details of the stain that have been used.
But are you able to, is there any way you're able to add some 3D, 4D dynamics with that kind of cement line staining? I guess not really. I can't think of how, but you showed it and I was wondering how you were using it.
I think you have the option with serial sectioning, which is obviously quite tedious, but that's possible. I've wondered, and I think one of the things that we're talking about with Thomas is clearing techniques and then using confocal techniques to get 3D in cleared tissues, if we can still maintain the stain. So that's something we're interested in, getting a more three-dimensional view on the molecular side of things.
Oh, yes, that would be awesome. Yeah. Thank you.
So thank you.
Another question from Mohammed. Great presentation. I'm wondering, with this data and AI model, is it possible to build a prediction model for the BMUs in aging or osteoporosis animal model?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, a few years ago, we had put together a proposal around virtual histology, and I think modeling this for predictive purposes is the ultimate goal, right? Can we make predictions? And the way we had phrased it was that with multiple time point imaging, for example, could we image time 1 and do a computer simulation to predict time 2 and then test it against the actual imaging and sort of have an iterative process. So absolutely, we're interested in that direction. And the AI side of this is really exciting. And I think it's exciting, I think, from the perspective that I think AI-based predictions and models are actually going to drive the need for more fundamental research, because these things are going to be garbage in, garbage out. So we need the data and we need the imaging to feed the AI. So I'm envisioning a very nice iterative loop. So absolutely, I think it's possible, and I think it's desirable. You could imagine the potential of that if you could model the impact of pharmaceuticals or different dosing regimens or other things. Could you design experiments more efficiently and then iteratively test them in animals? So yeah, these are all things we've absolutely been thinking about, but it's a great point.
Thanks. I'm going to jump in with just a technical question, because you mentioned the first image was in vivo and the next one was ex vivo, and those are slightly different resolution. Is it harder to get them kind of overlap with one another because of that?
Yeah, it is. I think it would be simpler computationally if we just did 2 low resolution in vivo images. The reason for the combination of in vivo and ex vivo is sort of twofold. One, the synchrotron imaging is highly limited in terms of the time. So we set up our initial experiments so that we just had one experiment at the synchrotron and then we could go away, and we didn't have to worry about problems technically there, or we didn't have to worry about access. The higher resolution thing, whether we do it in synchrotron or ex vivo after the fact, allows us to see much more information. So there's no doubt that in the in vivo images, we can see the larger spaces, we can see some of the larger pores that are unchanged, but we don't see everything. We do have some new tech that we're trying to push the limits on that. The ex vivo images show us all of the canals, all of the, like, I don't want to say there's primary, secondary, and there's like changed remodeled canals. But we need that information because those serve as the fiducial marks for registration. So things that haven't changed allow us between the two scans to put them together and have assurance that we got them matched up. So yeah, that's why the combination of the two, but it creates more computational issues and it produces much more data at high resolution.
Thanks. Is there any more questions? Doesn't look like it. Thank you so much, Dr. Kupa. It was a really informative session. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. Thanks for all the great questions.
Thank you. Please look out for our email for the next presentation that we are gonna have next month. Thank you.